We are live, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world, depending on where you're logging in from. Happy to have you join us today. My name is Greg Guglielmo. I'm the founder of Avanti Prep, an MBA admissions consulting firm. We also work with applicants on other types of graduate degree applications as well, though primarily centered around MBA programs. Happy to answer questions about all of that throughout this conversation today and at the end of our process. We invite you, of course, to visit avantiprep.com, AVANTIPREP, avantiprep.com, where you can review our services and resources, how we partner with clients, our testimonials, as well as sign up for a free consultation. So if you are potentially interested in working together, or if you have questions, more specific questions that arise out of today's conversation, we'll be able to connect on more of an individual level, because as we'll see in today's conversation, a lot of this, we'll talk through some big picture themes related to rounds and round strategy and how to mix your schools and all the questions that we've seen come up in the private chat on YouTube as well. But certainly there are things that are going to be much, much, much more nuanced and individual case based. So we could try to tackle those. And again, happy to connect for a free consultation at avantiprep.com. But my name again is Greg Guglielmo, and I'm happy to navigate through some of the waters here as June begins to bleed into July and round one deadlines become on the horizon, early September, really, as we go through and take a look. So topics that we'll cover today, again, are going to be application dates and deadlines, all things related to round and round strategy and timing and phasing and school strategy as it relates to rounds, reach schools, target schools, safer schools, how to mix, what the impact of different rounds might be, other little quirks and nuances and considerations that might exist with certain schools having rolling admissions or open interview periods, and all of those and everything else. And again, if we don't cover it, feel free to ask it in the comments. What you see here on a first slide, some of this is going to be a little bit of background. And by the way, too, we'll go through a few of these slides and presentations. I'll do a lot of talking, go into too much detail probably about a few things, but hopefully that detail helps, again, because I think with a lot of the application process, both in planning and timing things out, and then with your essays and resumes and recommendations and interviews, the devil is in the details here. Commitment to those details, unpacking those details, unpacking your life and your story when it comes application time, and really even kind of getting down to the word and the phrase when we're talking essays and resumes. The devil is in the details. So hopefully the details that we cover today are helpful. The first thing that we'll cover here, the slide in front of you, and I should say I'm not in presentation mode. I know that's a pet peeve of some people out there, but we're going to switch. I'm going to switch over a couple of screens at various points throughout this conversation. We're going to look at a deadline calendar briefly. We might even look at a couple of schools' deadline pages. So I'm going to toggle a little bit. If for any reason the text on the YouTube screen when I'm not in presentation mode, like if the text on the current slide is not totally visible or big enough, just mention it in the comments, and the admins and orchestrators can let me know, and I could go into presentation mode or zoom in and we'll figure it out. But what you see on the current page, application dates and deadlines, this is going to be a little bit of a primer, so apologies if it's obvious or known or basic to some of you out there, but we have a wide audience today. Some people probably only scratching the surface or just getting started with their application process. And there are a few kind of strategic nuggets and important nuggets to pull out of even the basics here. So let's rifle through those and talk through those. So application dates and deadlines, we're talking here about your typical full-time flagship 2-year MBA programs or 1-year MBA programs. What do those deadline calendars look like? And what you see on the page starting at the top is what they generally look like. Schools typically have 3 or 4 rounds. You see some movement on this. I'd say the average is 3. Some schools in recent years have added a 4th round deep into the spring. Harvard Business School kind of famously removed their 3rd round fairly recently. They're only down to 2. But you're typically looking at a round 1, a first application round, sometime in September that can run into mid-October, and a round 2 in the first half of January. And those dates, those are just like good factoids to know, but there's a little bit of strategy and some important takeaways to note in there. If you look there, round one, early September to mid-October. Harvard Business School usually classically, traditionally, has the first big deadline among the famous or top global schools. That it comes the day after Labor Day. For the people in the U.S. who are familiar with Labor Day, Labor Day is the first Monday of September. Harvard classically has their deadline fall the day after that, ruining a lot of Labor Day weekends as people tidy up their applications. Some schools like Duke Fuqua have an early deadline that falls a little bit before that. This year, Duke Fuqua's deadline September 2nd. But for all intents and purposes, we're kind of looking at an early September to mid-October range for round one deadlines. The observation there is that that's actually a pretty wide, that runs about 6 weeks, 5 or 6 weeks. It's going to feel concentrated. It's going to feel tight when you're navigating your way through it, but that's actually pretty wide relative to round two. Round two deadlines typically fall the first half of January. So all those deadlines that are spread across 6 weeks in round one are kind of concentrated between, let's say, January 2nd and 12th, 2nd and 13th, 2nd and 11th, depends a little bit. MIT Sloan's like a week later, but it's really pretty concentrated in round two. So that's a strategic takeaway. That's something to keep in mind and flag now. I know round two, January, feels pretty far away, but there is more of a spread in round one and more of a concentration in round two. And we'll talk about another strategic takeaway later. Can I wait to hear my round one results and then apply to schools in round two? That gets a little bit tricky because, again, those round two deadlines are hyper concentrated right after the new year. If you're looking to connect with schools and students, they are out of session. If you're looking to partner with, consultants or whomever, I mean, even to have friends look at your essays or whatever the case may be and give you feedback. People have the holidays, they have the new year. So we'll talk all about that. But that's just the general landscape. Rounds 3 and 4, where they exist, occur in March and April. We'll talk about whether round 3 is that a viable round. Should I even entertain it? As well as the differences primarily around round 1 and round 2. Round 1 and round 2 are going to be the main focus of our conversation today because those are the main rounds, the rounds in which, probably 90% of applicants apply. They're both mainstream rounds. They're both legitimate rounds. We'll unpack some of the nuances that exist within that. Fourth bullet point on the page you're looking at right now, there are some schools that have somewhat non-traditional round structures. I've got some examples there listed. INSEAD, Stern, Oxford, Cambridge. They don't have just September, January. They have September, October, January, or September, November, January. So there's an extra little round hiding for some schools in there. They also then have, kind of a later spring rounds as well. But I would say for those, you can think of the September, October, November, and January rounds as kind of equivalent 3 rounds that are together equivalent to rounds 1 and 2 at schools that have the more traditional structure. But strategic planning, again, like here, another takeaway. As you plan out your calendar and the cadence of your applications, if you feel overwhelmed by adding an additional school, I really want to apply to Oxford or Cambridge or Stern. If you're ready and that's one of your top choices, then do it in round 1, do it in September. But if you're kind of mixing and moving the chess pieces around, just remember for some schools, there is that little kind of October or November round that can slot in nicely between the traditional rounds 1 and 2. And there's some other schools that have some quirks like that, but those are some of the main ones that come to mind. Let's flip over screens really quickly. I've talked about managing this process and thinking through deadlines and how they fall. But again, to just give some, I'm a visual person, I guess you could say, but just to give a little bit of a visual on this, I'm going to share a deadline calendar screen that we produce most years up on the Avanti Prep website. That should come up right there. Okay, so you'll see a lot of deadline calendars out there. This one happens to be from 2 application seasons ago. You'll see a lot of deadline calendars out there in various blogs and resources and consulting firms and whoever posts them. They're usually lists. I kind of like to view the calendar because then we can see the actual space and number of days between deadlines. So here we start at the beginning of September. This again was from 2019-20 application season. So September of 2019 up on the screen, and you can see we like to put the schools and what type of deadline it is, and you can link directly to, and some of them actually will list what time it's due if you're kind of, that we don't recommend waiting till the last minute, but it can be helpful to know, is it due at midnight or 5 p.m. or what have you. So you can see there a typical deadline calendar. I mentioned earlier, Harvard usually kicked things off. I guess that year they were the Wednesday after Labor Day, not the Tuesday after Labor Day. Darden snuck in with an early action deadline 2 years ago beforehand. And there's going to be similar dynamics with this, but you can see the cadence. You can see how things fall and how they spread. And again, we have, again, this is not this year. You want to take a fresh look. We'll even post a fresh one for this year as the final schools come in with their deadline releases. But you could see how things kind of flow. And as you're measuring out your weeks and how many schools you think you might be able to apply to, the first of these deadlines are about 9 weeks away right now. But it doesn't mean every deadline is 9 weeks away. If you're entertaining, as we scroll down, some of these deadlines that exist in early October, and a lot of these schools tend to come in at fairly similar. Tuck this year is about a week earlier. Johnson's in a similar week, Cornell Johnson. So you're not always measuring to the first deadline. You might have 2, 3, 4, even 5 weeks in round one between round one deadlines. So it's important to visualize. It helps to visualize, and it helps to plan. This isn't always like the fun stuff of essays and stories and goals and resume, but it does matter. And planning it out certainly helps. So that helps us visualize the deadline calendar. And just to flip over to understand typical timing of application submission and interviews and decisions and deposits, let's flip over to Duke Fuqua's deadline page. So you could visit if you're curious to go through this process. And I would even encourage it, by the way, for the schools you think you are interested in. Even now, 9, 10 weeks out from when these deadlines start to hit, go page to page, build this. There are resources we post, we will post the calendar, and others will too, and you'll be able to find them. But building out school data, building out school deadlines, building out timing, however you like to do it, if it's in Excel or a Google Sheet or a Google Doc or a Word doc or a notebook, it helps you internalize, and that internalization process helps you even kind of begin to plan things out in your head. So you'll be able to see, do that for everything. Do that for essay questions and school data and who you've talked to at each school. And again, in whatever way helps you most. But visualizing something like this, even so basic as dates and deadlines, as boring as it may sound, gives you the opportunity to see what the key pillars and key moments are, and then play that back to whatever your strategy is. So Duke Fuqua has a very complete kind of listing here in that they show the deadline and when interview decisions are sent and when they release decisions and when they release deposit, or when your deposit would be due if you're admitted. And those are kind of like the 4 key moments, if you will. And you do have to kind of engineer around that. If you're going to apply to some schools in round 1 and you get in, and you want to apply also to schools in round 2, if you get into any in round 1 and you want to hold your spot, you're going to have to pay a deposit before you hear back about your round 2, your final decision of round 2. And this will help us visualize that a little bit. Duke has a pretty traditional round setup with rounds 1, 2, and 3, but they're unique in that they have an early action deadline. It is a binding early action deadline. So if you know that Duke Fuqua is your first choice, they invite you to apply early. You are committing, in doing that, you are committing to that if you get into Duke Fuqua, you would cancel your other applications. So you want to be sure that Duke is your first choice if you do that. But you could see the lineup here. You could see the rough cadence of when the application is due, and that, a couple of weeks later in early action, and 5 or 6 weeks later, 4 to 5 weeks later, for the regular rounds, you'd hear whether you got invited to interview. You would then interview, and in, let's say for round 1, in mid-December, you would hear your final decision. keep a couple of these dates in mind. Keep that mid-December date in mind. Maybe we'll even poke back to take a look at it, because that's going to matter when we talk about round. If I apply in round one, can I wait to hear my results and then apply to schools in round two? We'll talk about some of the considerations and trickiness, potential trickiness around that, because for most schools like Duke, this December 15th date is going to be when you hear your final, roughly December 15th, December 8th, 12th, 14th, 15th. Second week, mid-December, that's when you're going to hear your round one final results. If round two deadline's, 2 or 3 weeks later, so not much time. We'll talk about that later. Another quick thing here, we'll talk about early action and early decision in a second, but note the timing of the deposit deadline for Duke Fuqua's early action applicants. That deposit, not only have you committed to attending, you've already kind of checked the box and signed your name on that, but financially, if you get into Duke, you have to pay your deposit. Usually early deposits are actually bigger than regular deposit. First deposits are usually a little bigger. You're gonna have to pay your deposit before you hear your final results from most other round one schools in mid-December. Same thing exists as you're navigating between round one and round two. You are going to need to deposit schools you get into in round one. If you want to hold your spot, you're going to need to deposit. It varies by school, but let's say Duke, you'd have to deposit by February. Well, I'm not going to hear my round two results from, just as a representation. You wouldn't have applied to Duke in 2 rounds, but a lot of the other round two schools, you won't have deposited. You'll have deposited in February, and you won't hear round two results until March. So a lot of dates, a lot of detail, but the devil, again, is in the details. And you want to think through these things and plan them out. And we could go into more questions and such later. Things are going to be very you-specific, candidate-specific, etc. We'll go back to the presentation. Keep on ticking through our bullet points and get into some of the more fun and strategic stuff rather than dates and deadlines. Additional quirks and considerations up on the page here. There are some schools out there that have rolling admissions. 2 classic examples that come to mind are Columbia Business School and HEC Paris. Columbia, the roll is kind of not perpetual, but as soon as their application opens, it has actually opened already, all the way through, kind of into the spring. I would suggest not waiting until then. They have a merit fellowship deadline, usually in early January. The earlier, the better. We'll talk about some of those strategic considerations. Columbia also has an early decision deadline in the beginning of October. But yeah, those are two unique, even more non-traditional kind of application structures. Columbia rolling, HEC Paris rolling. HEC Paris, if you look on the website, you'll see it's rolling, and they consider it rolling, but they also have like monthly signposts where mini deadlines almost, if you will, each month that exist within the rolling period. You apply to one of those, you'll usually hear back within 5 weeks, I think, regarding an interview, and then you go from there. Columbia typically tells you you'll hear back, I think, within 6 weeks, and then you interview, and then you hear back about 2 weeks after that. But don't strategic takeaway here. Again, it kind of fit that in. If you're thinking about schools like this with rolling deadlines, you'll want to kind of fit that in to your strategy. But if you're really, really interested in these schools, don't push. Don't say, oh, well, they're rolling, so let me push them later. You could kind of fall into a little bit of a trap with that, where all of a sudden your interest in the school feels diluted. So rolling, there's, I would say, even more of a benefit to applying earlier in the period. You'd be shocked how many people wait until the end of December to try to sneak their Columbia application in before the January 5th merit deadline. They get a hyper concentration of apps. It just feels late. It's not your bet. Maybe the extra few weeks gave you a better app, but I would try to be out in front of that if you're interested in Columbia. And next bullet on the page, early decision, early action. Columbia has an early decision deadline. It falls this year in the beginning of October. It has traditionally fallen in the beginning of October. Columbia will review all early decision applications before they go into the regular apps. And even there, being early to the early decision can have benefits. I would say with early action and early decision, benefits of being of seizing those are even more pronounced. So we could take specific questions about specific schools during the Q&A. A couple of other examples, though, just so you have them flagged in your head. We'll take these from the U.S. top 25. Columbia, Duke Fuqua, Virginia Darden, Notre Dame Mendoza. These schools have early action or early decision deadlines. Action versus decision, it's kind of semantics. Columbia calls it early decision. Fuqua and Darden call it early action. Mendoza calls it early decision. The important thing to check beyond those words is whether it's binding. Whether if you seize that deadline, you are committing to attending. Of the schools listed here, Columbia is a commitment to attend. Fuqua is a commitment to attend. Mendoza is a commitment to attend. I have Darden in italics, University of Virginia Darden, because they actually give you two choices. You can apply early action and then choose, is it binding or non-binding? And you are signaling to the school. There is a benefit strategically to signaling a full commitment and total interest and first choice through the binding. But if you have to kind of make a personal decision and weigh the strategy, how interested am I in Darden? Do I want to kind of go for the kill, boost my chances with the early deadline, with the binding early deadline, or still express very sincere interest, but you're kind of letting them know by it being non-binding that you're chasing other schools as well. So you have to kind of calibrate that based on your own profile, scores, stats, chances, and we could talk more about that. Other quirks and considerations. Again, hopefully not boring details, but the devil is in these details. Who has open interview periods? Most schools, the kind of typical norm, as you may be familiar, is that you apply and then you're invited to interview. But there are certainly exceptions to that. Kellogg is a classic exception where they interview essentially everyone. But other schools have open interviews or open interview periods. Duke Fuqua traditionally does. COVID has kind of affected that a little bit. But Fuqua and Keenan Flagler, which are located fairly close to each other in North Carolina, they both typically have, in non-COVID years, open interview periods where you would be able to go down there and interview in person, usually September, October. Darden has, for their early action applicants this year, some open interview slots. And Tuck, I have in italics. They actually just released their deadlines the last day or two for this year. And as they did last year, so Tuck's round one deadline is September 28th. But if you apply by September 1st with a complete app, test scores, recommendations, whole thing, you are guaranteed an interview. So these sound like silly little details, but they're important details, because if you want to show forward interest, commitment to a school, if you have things lined up, and if you think you would benefit from getting in front of them, maybe you interview well, maybe you feel like you convey yourself best through interviews. These are important things to seize. And if you're ahead of the game, if you've taken your GMAT already or your GRE and you've got things lined up and you could get there, keep these in mind. If any of these schools in the examples, these quirks and considerations, if any of them jump off the page at you, internalize that, read a little bit more about it, and try to factor it into your strategy. Tuck, by the way, in non-COVID years, would usually invite anyone to come visit campus, and you could interview there. What they've done the last 2 years with this September 1st thing is, I guess, kind of still keeping the spirit of wanting to interview as many people as possible alive, but you can't come to campus, or especially last year you couldn't. Other things to look out for. There are merit aid deadlines. There are sometimes international deadlines. Merit aid deadlines would be like, you could look, actually, well, we don't need to flip back to Duke, but Duke, Fuqua, we had them up on the page before, just as a representative example. You have to apply no later than round 3. Well, I guess that's any round for them to be considered for merit aid. But for other schools, that's going to be round 2. So look for those details. If you're interested in scholarships, if you're pursuing scholarships, sometimes there's a cutoff. We mentioned Columbia, rolling admissions, January 5th or thereabouts is the last date by which you can apply. It's early January, plus or minus. By which you can apply and also then be reviewed for merit aid. It's usually going to be, the school will list it on their page. It's usually going to be roughly round 2, maybe round 3. International, if you're an international student, and this works if you're from outside the United States applying to schools in the US or vice versa or anywhere around the globe, just watch out for these things. International deadlines, I would say a lot of US schools either say explicitly international applicants must apply by round 2, and it usually is round 2 as the cutoff, or they have a strong recommendation that you apply by no later than round 2 to allow ample time for visa processing and all those logistics, which we know have been, compromised or slowed down even more so by COVID and things related to that. So watch out for those deadlines too. Additional quirks and considerations. Couple bullets there at the bottom of the page. Top programs are currently in the process of releasing their essays and opening their applications. For the most part, everybody's released their deadlines, I would say, but there are still plenty of schools out there that haven't yet opened their applications and said what their essay questions for this year are going to be. It might even be still around 50-50. I think with COVID last year and this year, those essay questions are getting publicized and apps are opening a little later than they have in previous years. Examples, Duke Fuqua, again, not to beat a dead horse with that, but Duke Fuqua, they've updated their deadlines as we saw. But if you look on their page, they said their application is going to open in mid-July, probably one of the later ones. Wharton has released their deadlines, but they said their applications are going to open in July. So probably it'll be early July. But those are just some things to keep in mind, and a good takeaway, a good thing to think about as you think through your timing. Last bullet on the page, you can definitely get started on your application process now. You kind of know what you're going to need on the resume front. You know that you're going to need to introspect and dissect and deconstruct all these different stories and experiences and who you are and what makes you a leader and why you want to go to business school and why you need an MBA and what your goals are. All those things can be worked. You essentially know you're going to need 2, in some cases 1 letter of recommendation, and you essentially know what those questions are going to be, though there can be small variants with some of those schools. So you can absolutely get mobilized now. You don't need to wait for a Duke or for some of these final schools to release their essay questions for the year. But you should watch out for essays. You want to make sure if you start working on any essays that they are in fact at 100% going to be the essay questions for that school this year. You don't want to work on essays because you see them up on a website and then they turn out to be last year's essays and you just spend a lot of time. But there's tons you could do in the app process, but just watch out for essays. You kind of have to build your list of schools and check who has definitively opened their apps and released their essay questions this year before you dig in deeply on the essays. But a lot of that other story and strategy and deconstructing your story, thinking through your goals, reaching out to schools, recommenders, resume, you can absolutely get mobilized on that. And we certainly are working with applicants on all of that, even if and ahead of specific essay questions coming out. On to the next, and maybe some of the more meatier strategic stuff that folks out there were curious about. Round 1 versus round 2. Does applying in round 1 versus round 2 affect my chances? It's a very difficult and kind of nuanced question. So let's think through it. And here again, we're comparing. It's underlined for a reason. We are comparing round 1 and round 2 here. I think we could say with a lot more kind of black and white certainty that applying in round 3 or around 4, that definitely affects your chances. That's known, that's gut, that's data. We know that. If we had to kind of quantify and qualify the round 1 versus round 2, it's a little more complex. We'll try to extract some rules of thumb related to that. For context, application volume at a kind of classic flagship 2-year top program. We've seen quotes from Michigan Ross, for example, say that about 30% of their applications come in round 1, About 55% come in round two. And, if there's a tail on that, a 10 to 15% tail, it would be in later or subsequent rounds. I think that's a fairly decent, from an app volume standpoint, a pretty decent representation. If it's a third, round two might have twice the volume as round one. More people do apply in round two is a takeaway from that. How does that affect, and that'd be fairly consistent, I think, across similar schools. It might even be more pronounced at some schools. But roughly thereabouts, if you're looking for app volume context, more people apply in round two. You'll hear the occasional anecdote that the folks who apply in round one a little more prepared and sometimes higher scores. I don't know if that's statistically significant, but you'll hear a little bit about that. So that's app volume. What about application rates? That's maybe the more important thing for what people are curious about. I would say that there, statistically, from an admissions rate perspective, there's not perfect data on this, but if you had to kind of put a statistic out there, I think you would usually find, based on this kind of ad hoc mix of official data and unofficial data and different studies that have been done, sometimes based on self-reported data, I think you'll usually see about a 2 to 3 an admit rate in round one that is about 2 to 3 percentage points higher than in round two. So if the average across top 15 programs is a 20%, I'm kind of making that number up. The average admit rate is about 20% in round one. It would be about 17% in round two, or 17.5% in round two. That's 2 to 3 percentage points, which in percent terms would be a little higher. A 20 dropping to 18 is a 10% fall, a 2 percentage point fall, but a 10% fall. So you could kind of take from there are different interpretations of that. Some people would say, oh, it's only marginal, and maybe the applicants in round one were a little more, ahead of the game and had their act together and that sort of thing. Or other people would say, hey, that's actually a pretty big difference. It's only 2 percentage points, but 20 going to 18, that's a 10% drop. So there are levels and layers of interpretation within that. If I had to kind of put some data to it, that's the data, the best data, messy data, but that's the best data, messy data and unofficial data, but that's the data that I would quote. More importantly, though, for you is, and here's where we get into some of the rules of thumb, and the rules of thumb have little buts to them. So it's like you say one thing, but there's something else to consider, and it does become very individually oriented and case by case. You should primarily, and you'll see this throughout quotes from admissions committees, and if you attend information sessions, which you absolutely should be doing, school research and engagement, information sessions, coffee chats, visiting virtual classes, engaging with schools, speaking to clubs and admissions ambassadors at schools you're interested in, deep school research and engagement. We could go on a tangent about that later on. You will hear them most often say to choose round one versus round two primarily based on when you feel your application will be strongest and most complete. Apply basically as early as you can, so long as you're putting your best foot forward, so long as your application is complete and you've not rushed things and you've not rushed essays and you've not, thrown in super general, undeveloped goals and reasons for pursuing an MBA, and you've not skirted over, school research and engagement and getting to know programs. You'll know there's gut. There's some level of gut. You just know, and of course you can ask friends, ask colleagues, ask if you have peers in the program, or if you're partnering with an admissions consultant. Obviously, they will let you know about that. But you'll know when it's complete and it's your best or almost best foot forward, and that's when we should apply. So there is that little statistical 2 percentage point thing I talked about, round one versus round two. But really, for you, you want to apply as early as you can, so long as your application feels complete and full and when it will be strongest. That's the primary rule of thumb. Now, if you can, so here's the big but underline, the third bullet on the page. If you can put your best foot forward early, do it. Apply in round one, or if you're committed to a certain school, apply early action or decision if they have such a deadline. So there are some benefits here to going early. And here's where we get into like these different funny layers, and some almost feel contradictory. Round one and round two are both mainstream rounds. In fact, round two attracts oftentimes twice the number of applicants as round one. They are both absolutely fair game and mainstream rounds, and there's no shame at all in applying to round two. The statistical implications are fairly marginal. You should choose between those rounds primarily based on when your application feels full and complete and you're ready. But there are some benefits in there of applying to round one. So if you can do it, we would encourage you to do so. We'll talk about how many schools and what exact timing and weeks as we tick through this in the next page. I've got a little asterisk in there about your best foot forward. Here's where you have to digest some of the marginal trade-offs. You'll hear that quote, kind of best foot forward. If you could put your best foot forward in round one, do it. Well, what if it's like 98.5% of my best foot forward? Then you should probably still apply in round one. The benefits, and that's where it gets very personal, and it can be kind of a gut check or something that you, with whoever you're partnering with or whoever is kind of advising you, or people who might take a look at your applications. If you're like almost all the way there, don't wait until round two just to fix 2 bullets on your resume. You get those bullet points fixed and get the application in round one. So there are little kind of margins like that. You want it to be your best foot forward. But if everyone's going to think it's your best, it looks like your best, and maybe you think in your head it's like 99% of your best, 99% of your best should be submitted in round one. So again, it's kind of gut. You should know. And if you don't know, then I think ask for opinions on it. If essays are rushed, if it's not you, if it's not authentic, if it's not, if you're not sharing your soul on the page for those type of essays, if your resume is sloppy or unprofessional or undeveloped, if your recommenders rush, if you just reached out to them a week before the deadlines, if you haven't spoken to anyone at the schools you're applying to, those are clearer signs that if you've not thought through your goals and have specifically developed short, medium, long-term goals where asked, and an deep understanding of why each school, from a resources and a culture and community perspective, you'll know. And if you don't ask opinions, whether you say, okay, I'm not ready for round one, then definitely you look ahead to round two. Benefits of round one, by the way, 4th bullet on the page. What does it show? Why do those benefits exist? Well, it shows the school very early and engaged interest. It helps you become kind of the first you to the post, as unique as we all are and you all are, and as much as you want, and in working with applicants, we want to unpack and present that uniqueness. There are a lot of similar applicants and applicant demographics and people with similar jobs and similar schools and similar experiences and similar stats. So there can be benefits to being the first you to the post. That's where some of the benefits of round one a little more qualitatively come into play. There are no seats taken in the class yet in round one. And on a scholarship financial side of things, there are more scholarships available. Schools handle that a little bit differently. Some will kind of balance them between rounds, but anecdotally, I would say, and in years and years of working with applicants, I think we see a little more pronounced scholarship benefit in round one. Next bullet, this can be especially important in cases of overrepresentation and record application volume. What do we mean by that? Well, I mentioned earlier that if we had to try to pin a data point on the difference between round one, it might only be 2 percentage points. Round one might have an acceptance rate that's roughly 2 to 3 percentage points higher than round two if we had to average it between schools. But if you're applying from a very overrepresented applicant pool, and in cases such as this most recent year, and to some extent the year before, with record application volume, we don't have perfect look through to data on that, but I would guess and feel pretty confident that that's 2 or 3 percentage point difference would be even more magnified. Meaning that if you are applying from a very overrepresented, it could be professional, it could be national group, and especially in years of record application volume, the benefits of round one are even more pronounced. It's not to scare you or put pressure on you or contradict what I said earlier that round two is a totally legit and viable round, but they are things to keep in mind. And if you're kind of teetering now and maybe I'm taking the GMAT in July 14th and then I'm measuring out whether I can get apps in round one, and I'm looking at that deadline calendar that I built up because I'm going to have 6 weeks until one deadline and 9 weeks until another and 12 weeks until another. You probably will have incentive then to say, let me try to make this happen in round one, rather than giving myself the cut. You'll have to work a little harder for those 6, 9, or 12 weeks, but there are benefits, and the benefits are even more pronounced in cases of overrepresentation and record app volume. And again, measuring those weeks out and measuring how many schools and whether that's viable is a very personal and case-by-case kind of choice. If you already have the GMAT or GRE score that you need right now, what score you need is a whole, we could do a whole video just about that. But if you're on this call and you've already got your score in hand and you feel like that's the score and I'm not taking the test again, I would say you should apply in round one. You're ready. You have that score. You're ready to transition into application focus. If you haven't already, we talked a slide or two ago about how even if certain schools haven't released their exact essay questions for this year yet, there's tons you can be doing in order to build your application momentum toward that, so that when the essay questions do get released, you're ready to start working on those. So if you have the score you need, definitely look at those early apps if relevant, but round one where you can. If you're still taking the GMAT or GRE, then you have a little bit more of a decision, and we have some questions about that in the comments that we'll address. Then you kind of, what I have in parentheses here, GMAT then application. Should I focus on the test exclusively and then pivot into my apps, or should I try to juggle both at the same time? That's a personal and working style. You got to know thyself on that. If you're somebody who feels like in order to maximize your GMAT score, and if you're from a hyper competitive applicant pool where you really need a high score to kind of entertain or be competitive at schools, the type of tough schools you're interested in, then, and again, if you're the type who needs to go fully into the GMAT, and then you want to pick your head up from that and switch into apps, that's a style choice. You might then dedicate time to GMAT and then time to apps, and you'll have to look at when you take the test, if you need to retake it, and when you get the score you want or need. Others out there stylistically might be able to manage both GMAT and applications at the same time, run parallel streams. It can be difficult, but if maybe you're still working from home, or maybe you have the bandwidth to do that, maybe just style-wise you're able to pull it off, personal style, you could run 2 work streams at the same time and still get the score you need on the GMAT side, still get apps in round one. Happy to take questions about that. Last bullet on the page, though, if your score is out of range, again, we could do a whole video about scores and ranges and scores you need and how that can be applicant specific. If you're not sure, ask, post in forums, talk to people who have a very nuanced understanding of things. But if your score is out of range, then you're interested in a certain set of schools and need a certain type of score to have a chance at those schools, then you will almost certainly need to retake the exam and apply later or in round two. And if you can't get the score to where you need it, You might need to recalibrate schools. And if you're not interested in schools that are a little, meaning widen your school list down in the rankings to where your score will be competitive. If you're not interested in that, then that's a whole kind of different decision. And there are gradients within this too, right? I think you probably know in your gut, and if you speak to the right people, you'll know if your score is out of range. But should I chase 10 more points on the GMAT? I'm kind of right there. Those are very personal and case specific questions. Kind of like above though, if you with your apps, if you're right there, you have a 720 but wish you had a 730, feel like you could get a 730, or my application is, people will think it's my best, maybe I could have done one little thing a little better if I ruminated on it. But if you're right there, get it in. Or don't chase 10, don't apply in round 2 just to chase 10 points on the GMAT in most cases. But if you're definitely out of range, then you really should retake and apply later, because if you apply in round 1 with a score that's out of range, you're not even in contention. You need to get kind of in contention on the GMAT side. And GMAT's not the be all end all, don't get me wrong. But there are certain situations, and you can look up, and you should look up the data for schools, see what their average GMATs are, see what their middle 80% ranges are, and calibrate that also to the pool of applicants from which you're applying, because there can be significant variance within that. Even more strategy to layer onto this. And here we'll get into some of the questions that we've seen. I think the first question posted by Justin earlier on, at round 1 versus round 2, and different schools, and how to split them and stuff like that. How many schools should I apply to overall, or by round, and that kind of thing? I'll give you a little data again, just to kind of calibrate things for context, and then we could kind of personalize it. The typical applicant, this varies a lot by applicant. If I had to quote averages, I would say that a lot of U.S. applicants classically, pre-COVID, let's say also, you might see an average of 5 or 6 schools for applicant to apply to, roughly 5 or 6 schools in aggregate or in a single round, let's say, with variance. I mean, you certainly have people out there who are only interested in 2 schools because they specialize in something really specific, or they're in a certain geography and they only want to go to those, or they have an amazing professional opportunities in front of them already, so they're only willing to leave that for the top 3 or the top 5, and it becomes a very select list. But if I had to quote an average on the U.S. applicant side, probably 5 to 6. And if you get into where you want it to go in round 1, you might not even need round 2, and that's why the average is usually around that number. International applicants, and in particular, not all international applicants, I should say international applicants from hyper-competitive applicant pools, we usually see a higher number. I think I've seen averages of 8, for example, for applicants from India. And anecdotally, I would even say we've seen more than that. You have to manage those numbers. And often when you're talking about numbers like that, 8, 9, 10 applications, you really are talking about a multi-round effort. Then the reason for that, by the way, is because the hyper-competitive nature of the process for applicants. It's a supply and demand thing. And, if you're plugged into GMAT Club, you'll observe it in depth. You'll see studies about it. And GMAT Club is a top 50 analysis, MBA admissions results by various data points for Indian applicants. In this case, across the top 50 U.S. schools, was posted about 3 years ago. Very, very good, 5,000 plus sample size analysis, worth checking out. But you usually see a higher number because it's more unpredictable. It's harder to kind of put one's finger on, and even if you do a great job, there can be just quirks and things. That's why you got to try to seize every advantage you can, which can include, if you're ready, applying early and in round 1. But how many schools should I apply to if I'm looking to kind of personalize that context? And by the way, too, we did see this last year with COVID. record app volume at a lot of schools. Some cases we've seen in the media. We'll see the official results in a few months, but 30 apps up 20%, 30%, even higher at some schools that had test waivers. And because applicants were home, many were home, working from home, and also, limited social life. Not a lot of people get out of the house, depending what country you're in. People were sitting at home and apply to an extra school and an extra couple of schools. So we saw those numbers go up a little bit more this past application year. But to personalize that, think to yourself, what is the number? I have as many as written on the page. You can think about potentially the number of applications you're able to produce in a given round. And if you want to maximize that, try to find whatever number of apps it would be where you're not compromising the quality of all of your applications by submitting that additional app. You kind of have to know your gut and look at your calendar, your application deadline calendar, to calibrate that for yourself. If you feel like you can do 4 schools really, really well in round 1, but that adding a 5th will undermine the effort and you end up with lesser quality at all the schools, or you end up with a terrible 5th application, you kind of feel that. And you don't want to take that extra school on in those cases. So it's kind of as many as you can do really well and as many as you can put your best foot forward with. Here again, you probably want to eyeball very specifically when different deadlines fall, and whether you might have a several week gap then between deadlines, and maybe you can get that extra one in. Or you even want to look at what the requirements are of a given school. If the recommendation questions are identical, if they're the common LOR questions, it's not really an extra lift for your recommenders. And if the essay questions are lean for that marginal school, you probably have a better chance of being able to fit it into round 1 versus a school with a lot of essays or really dense kind of app or different kind of rec questions or other kind of onerous requirements. So you have to look at those. How should I mix my dream, target, and safer schools? And that rule of thumb, by the way, for number of schools, that exists kind of between rounds and within rounds. But that rule of thumb, as many as I can do really, really well without compromising, without sinking the whole ship or compromising or undermining all my apps. How should I mix my dream, target, and safer schools between rounds, or my reach, target, and safer schools between rounds? This is a really interesting question, and it does vary, of course. I keep saying that from person to person. There are absolutely going to be people out there who say, well, again, I have a really, really good job and huge opportunities, the type of opportunities that I would have coming out of schools ranked 5 to 15. I already have that job now, so I'm not keen on those schools. I'd only leave to go for I'd only leave this job to if I get into the top 5. Well, in that case, that person's going to apply to only those schools, and they're going to have a high concentration, even if their reach is in a certain round. But for everybody else, for the average applicant or typical applicant, how should I mix my dream, target, and safer schools between rounds? I prefer a mix. We prefer to see a mix between rounds. Every year, kind of without fail, at the beginning of application season, even kind of right now, we get free consultation sign-up requests, or after round 1, people who didn't get anywhere in round 1 and now are thinking about round 2 and wondering what went wrong. We'll talk to people every year who put all their hardest, let's say last year they applied on their own. They applied to like 4 of their dream schools in round 1. They did not get in. They recalibrated it. They say, okay, I got to apply to 4 more schools in round 2. They did that and they missed those. And they actually felt like maybe they were qualified or even a little overqualified for the round 2 schools. And they wonder what went wrong here. We like, third bullet point on the page in italics, avoid the application trap of reaching too far in round 1, missing, then rushing or reaching again in round 2 and missing again. Avoid the application trap of reaching too far in round 1, missing, rushing in round 2, and missing again. that is a trap we see kind of time and time again. People get overly ambitious, or they don't grapple adequately with the competitive dynamics, just how hard it is to get into certain of these schools. They don't perhaps calibrate that for their applicant pool, and what even some of the data, whether it's the data or just their profile and where they've worked and all those kind of things. And definitely inform yourself, and be honest with yourself about what those chances are. And therefore, and I think Bogdan, posting as BB, has a nice post on this: round one versus round two versus applying in both. And he kind of, toward the end of that post or the middle of that post, he shares a similar kind of setup where he's got stretch, target, and safeties listed in both rounds. And that's really where I would come out on it. You don't want to reach too far in round one, miss, then you kind of hear your results in this November and December, and now you're scrambling. Schools that you apply to in round two, in that case, if you applied to them in round one and prioritized them and showed that early interest and engaged with the school, try to lock that up. So I would recommend kind of it doesn't necessarily need to be a parallel balance between round one and round two, but I would, in most cases, if I had to generalize, recommend some degree of calibration like that. But here again, it's going to be you specific, because there are preferences. You say, well, I don't want to apply to, I don't even want to go to this safer school. I'd rather just stay at my job. Well, then probably you shouldn't apply to any of those schools in those tiers. Other people on the flip side might say, I really prioritizing scholarships. Well, if you're prioritizing scholarships, you want to include more schools where you are kind of a positive stats outlier or a positive profile outlier for the typical applicants of those schools, and you'd want to accelerate those a little bit more into round one. Or if you felt like you had your set of schools and you felt pretty confident from a profile and application execution perspective and stats perspective that even if you had a balanced mix or a rough mix of dream target, it doesn't have to be perfectly balanced. It doesn't have to be 6 schools, 2 reaches, 2 targets, 2 safer. You can calibrate that mix based on your instincts around your chances of getting into those schools. Maybe it's 2 reaches, 3 targets, and 1 safer school. And then you can kind of take inventory or have a couple of schools ready in your head for round 2. Read the tea leaves a little bit. You'll know where you're getting interview invites a few weeks after you submit. So you'll have some signals, but it can be, next bullet on the page, it can be difficult to wait, if not extremely difficult to wait, for all of your round 1 results to then pick up and apply in round 2. We looked earlier at the Duke Fuqua deadline page. A lot of schools with typical round 1 deadlines, they have December, they have roughly mid-December deadlines. Mid-December notifications. Well, if I don't hear from my round 1 schools until mid-December, and round 2 deadlines are due January 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, you don't have time, and that's where people fall into the trap. So if you think you're going to have to read the tea leaves a little bit, know thyself, and be ready and kind of have slated, if you're thinking about applying to schools in round 2, have them kind of teed up in your head and already be working on them, because concentrating that whole effort into like a 2 or 3 week period around the holidays can be extremely difficult. And you're not going to be able, if you're just starting from 0 in December, you're not going to be able to, in most cases, adequately engage with and understand the schools that you're applying to. And that's when you could end up on the outside looking in for schools you really think you could have gotten into and would have likely gotten into in round 1 if you mobilized early and if you put that school into an earlier slot. So again, it's you specific, and you're reading how your results are coming in round 1. So if you feel like you want to have, you feel like, okay, I'm getting it. Looks like I'm going to get in somewhere. I'm feeling pretty good about round 1. I got a ton of interview invites. I'm getting a lot of positive kind of momentum. maybe I'll go for like a dream school in round two because I end up with something in my pocket in round one that I really am excited about. You will have to pay a deposit at that round one school. Um, in order to hold your spot, but then you maybe chase a dream or two in round two. Other people, conversely, might say, oh, this is not going as I hoped. I'm going to need to recalibrate downward a little. You get no interview invites, unfortunately, or only one in round one. I'm going to need to calibrate downward in round two, but don't wait until you hear your round one results. To do that, you got to start reading the tea leaves sooner and start engaging with those schools and mobilizing and understanding them and engaging with the applications. Should I even bother with round three? I'm going to say that hopefully this is not applicable to anyone who's joining this chat today. It's June 25th. We've got 6.5 months until round two deadlines. So round three, today's conversation was focused on round one and round two for a reason, because those are the two classic and mainstream and voluminous rounds when most applicants are applying 90-ish%, probably if we go by representative data. It doesn't mean that people don't get in round three, but we do see admissions rates fall off a cliff a bit, at least halved. I think that would even be generous in some cases, probably lower than that. So really, I would say focus on round one and round two, case by case, round three, timing specific for certain people, life specific, job specific. But in a lot of cases, by the time we're talking about round three, there is a more thorough conversation, comprehensive conversation that should be had around whether you should just wait until round one of the following year, which by March is only, March where round three falls, it's only about 6 months away till round one of the following year. So rather than be the last person throwing an app at a school, you could become the first person out in front, fully engaged, fully researched, well networked at the school, deeply introspected, excellent and well-developed apps. That becomes a more serious conversation. And again, if you're joining this call today, unless the GMAT pushes you out really, really far, probably not going to be applicable to you. So that's a lot of information in a full hour of detail and strategic considerations and road mapping. I know it's a lot to digest. I hope it didn't get too boring there along the way. If you have questions or thoughts, not only about rounds, of course, but about all of the other more interesting and use specific and goal specific and why MBA and why each school and how to approach this process, how we approach this process, how we work with applicants, and all the different things to think about. We invite you again to sign up for a free consultation at avantiprep.com. The link is there up on the page, and let's pivot over to some questions. I know these get slated for a certain amount of time, but I'm happy to dive through some of these. So Justin, I think we handled that. And we could also, too, by the way, I don't know if the admin is still with us, but sometimes pops salient questions up on the page, which I can read and then answer, as opposed to trying to cycle through all of these. But as we do that, and if we do that, we had a question from Harshal. What if I take the GMAT in August and then leverage one more month for essay building, apply in round two? Is that gamble worth taking, or just apply in round one and build essays in 10 days? So I'm taking the GMAT in August. So here's where we get into the very, there's the question up on the page. Here's where we get into this to very specific scenarios and individual scenarios. I mentioned earlier, there are different kind of, I guess, personality types out there and working types out there, and you got to know thyself. There are going to be some people, probably more in the minority, I guess I would say, who are able to juggle both at the same time, or maybe their job allows them to do that, where they can actually feel like they're fully preparing for the GMAT and can start to mobilize on their apps. Some people be able to do that. I know it's a lot to juggle, and you do want to maximize your score. But those folks might be able to say, I'm going to target round one. In Harshal's case, take my GMAT in August, hopefully get the score I want or need. Most people, though, probably fall into the bucket. I'd probably put myself in it too, where I say, I want to, nail the GMAT. I'm taking it in August. If I'm applying from a particularly competitive applicant pool and really, really need to hit a certain score, well, I want to know, and I want to devote the time to making sure I hit that score, or roughly that score. So let me take the GMAT in August. So and put my head down on that. I think even then, there are probably some things, if I'm devoting like 90% of my time to the GMAT, there are some things I can be doing in parallel from a school research, school networking, club outreach, admissions ambassador outreach perspective, maybe a little bit of resume work or get out in front of your recommenders, that could tee you up to get some apps done in round one, Harshal, but it kind of depends where you're applying. We looked at that calendar earlier. Some round one deadlines are September 2nd, early deadline September 2nd or September 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th. If you're taking it depends when in the month you take when in August you take the GMAT. The early September deadlines might be pretty tough, but 10 days would be, I think, really tough. But if the round one deadlines fall a little later in September or into early October, and you are selective, maybe you're not able to do 5 or 6 schools as you'd hoped in round one, but if there are 2 and it might be GMAT contingent, I think you might be able to and probably could get a couple, but it's going to be specific to when you take the test in August. It's going to be specific to the schools. It's going to be specific to which schools you apply to and when their deadlines fall. And also probably it matters, like, what's your comfort level with going through this process? Are you somebody who feels like you can tell your story really effectively through essays? Have you gotten to know schools already? Have you really introspected about your goals, and you kind of know, and you've really unpacked the details at a very, very, very specific level of those goals, of why you want an MBA, of why you're interested in these schools? If you've already done some of that, you might be able to kind of pick your head up for the GMAT and get it done. So hopefully Harshal's example is something that can project out to others who are navigating similar timelines right now. We can take next question. Do scholarships depend on which round I apply in? We touched on this briefly before. I would say a couple things to note there. There are scholarship deadlines for certain schools, or merit scholarship. They'll only review you for merit aid if you apply by round 2 or round 3. Check what it is specific to your school, or by a certain date. And I would say anecdotally, different schools manage this a little bit differently. Some will say we keep, similar scholarship availability between rounds. Anecdotally, I would say that we see more scholarship. We tend to see higher offers and more offers in round one. So I think being first to the post, and again, you're the first to the post, and that sort of thing, it can play into scholarships as well. The first goal, of course, by the way, though, is to get into the school. Scholarships are icing on the cake. And if you are prioritizing scholarships, then do remember you need to be operating as kind of a plus applicant for that school. Your GMAT score, if your GMAT score already needs to be higher than that school's average for your applicant demographic or your applicant pool, it's going to need to be a lot higher, or significantly higher, to start to get into the range of scholarship, merit scholarship, and that sort of thing. And if scholarships are a priority, then look earlier if you can, but also think about widening your range of schools to include more schools where you would be a plus applicant, or a positive outlier from a stats perspective and an experience perspective and a school perspective and so forth, and under a college perspective. I'm planning to appear for the GMAT in the 3rd week of July. I come from a highly overrepresented group. Should I aim to apply in round 1? So I think a similar question as we took 2 ago. with a little bit of an earlier GMAT take in this case. I think that if you are able to begin, and I don't know if it's a 90-10 or an 80-20, but if you're allocating 80 or 90% of your mental energy to the GMAT now, and maybe 10 or 20 to making sure that you're starting to build momentum on the things you can build momentum on, school research and engagement, introspecting about your goals, introspecting about your story, and what makes you unique, and specific moments and examples and things in your life. We start all of our applicants that we work with a multi-page questionnaire. It's 20 questions, or as the saying goes, I think it's actually about 25 questions, but you don't even need to roadmap necessarily to that level of detail, but networking with the schools, understanding your goals, understanding your why MBA at specific levels, getting to know programs. If you are able to allocate, maybe working on your resume, starting to reach out to and meet with your recommenders to explain this process to them and the questions that whatever that 10 or 20% is, you got to know thyself again. Some people say I got to be 100% on the GMAT in order to get the score I need, and that's fine too. But if you are able to siphon off some of that mental allocation, 10 or 20%, build momentum so that when you pick your head up on the third week of July from the GMAT, you actually are then able to thrust into the application process, and you're not starting from zero. Then I think you can likely, and I would say if you get the right kind of GMAT score, I think you can and should apply in round one to whatever number of schools you feel like you can do without compromising or without doing a poor job with one of them. For some people, they might say, if I'm taking the GMAT third week of July, I can get 2 good ones done in round 1, or 3 or 4. But if the deadlines are later, you got to look at that calendar and really, figure it out. Some of them are going to be later September, some are going to be first half of October. Then I think it is viable. And some of these this question and 2 questions ago, it kind of matters too, like how skilled are you, or how much do you trust yourself in terms of your ability to convey these stories. There are people out there who love essay writing, and there's a whole conversation around, like, is this whole MBA application process too essay focused? You could have a video just about that. But if you feel like, hey, I'm somebody who communicates really well through essays and the written word, and I already have, I think my resume is already in great shape, and my recommenders have done this before. Like, those are things to think about too, because then you'll know that you'll be able to execute more quickly than the person who has never built a 1-page resume of this style before, or was in maybe the military and doesn't have a resume at all, or has a completely different kind of resume, or whatever the case may be. And it also probably depends too, if you are working with an admissions consultant, there's an there's a framework and an acceleration. You're still the one, doing the work, but you have a guide through that, and there is acceleration that can occur. Things can get done more quickly as you kind of pass essay reviews and resume reviews back and forth. We can take a couple more questions here. I have a strong profile, except for the fact that I was made redundant due to COVID, which perhaps means let go. If so, I'm sorry to hear that. It is something that, unfortunately rattled through different industries and companies. Should I apply in round 1 or round 2? Very tricky and personal question. Generally, we would say that applying from the point of unemployment is disadvantageous and can sometimes be a red flag. Here we're trying to thread the needle on a couple of things too, and I think being let go due to COVID, I'd have to hear more about what kind of company, what kind of job, what is the rest of this strong profile that you reference. I think COVID is going to be a more COVID-driven situations like this will probably be more understandable on the part of admissions committees. So if you feel like you have a really strong profile and the right kind of scores, and this is a very explainable or justifiable, if unfortunate, situation, and and you are in process of trying to find that next opportunity, I am kind of inclined here toward round one, airline industry pilot job. Okay, so I think very explainable here. I think you have other interesting challenges unique to your application process about transitioning from being a pilot, very unique experience, very non-traditional and non-business oriented. You're going to have a whole different kind of approach now. Why am I transitioning into an MBA? What are my goals? What am I interested in? Do I have any knowledge, skills, or experience that are relevant to, and I'm sure you do, you just have to unpack that. Do I have any kind of business training or business coursework? Those could be things you need to consider if you're going in with just pilot training. You might want to take some business courses to show them that your preparedness. That could push you more toward round two. But the other parts of it, if they line up, I actually think round one in this case, because it's a airline industry pilot job, very understandable why during COVID that wouldn't have worked out. But I think you probably want to show that you're in process of mobilizing toward a new job. If you're going to go to an MBA program after being a pilot and you have this inflection point, is there anything you could do, maybe rather than going into another pilot job, is there anything you could do from an internship, externship, business-oriented job perspective in the 9 months or whatever between now, or 9 to 12 months between now and when you'd start the program? And then you could signal that and present that, even if it's future tense, or even if you've just started it, because you want to transition from airline industry into, or from being a pilot into business and pursue an MBA. You took this inflection point, you took this opportunity of being made redundant or let go to build your business, build a year of experience that is going to be relevant and salient, even if most of it to the MBA, even if most of it is yet to come. It's something you can talk about in your, probably an optional essay to let them know about, as well as any other business related coursework, which again might be a consideration for you. Let's take 2 or 3 more questions. We'll go for a few more minutes. What do you mean overrepresentation? Slide 3. If I have diverse 8-year entrepreneurial work experience. So overrepresentation, I think it can mean a number of things. It can be professional type of industry. Do you come from a type of job, like finance and consulting would be classic pre-MBA feeder industries, which can have lots of benefits, but are also hugely saturated amongst applicants. So to the point where at elite schools, if you come from a consulting firm or financial firm, using these examples, that is not very high on the hierarchy, for lack of a better term, in terms of what the company is or the type of job is, it's hard to break up from. It can be hard to break up into a certain caliber of school so there's professional overrepresentation. I think the big one, though, that gets talked about a lot is more demographic or applicant pool overrepresentation. Not to get too into the weeds here, but if you look at data, and you hate to pin it all to pin it back to data, but I think it's informative in understanding application landscape. We have a lot of folks joining us from India on this call. We work with a lot of applicants from India, and it's a huge and overrepresented applicant pool. Supply and demand becomes difficult, and it even feels odd using those words, but there are tons of applicants competing for X number of spots in MBA programs. A lot of US MBA programs are like 2/3. They might be 65% US students and 35% international students. Those international students come from all over the world, and some portion, sometimes a nice portion, but it's only some portion coming from India. And you can run the number. Look at the size of a class. Okay, a class has 600 people in it. 400 are going to be from the US, 200 are going to be from India, and what number of those, the typical class, 200 are going to be international, some portion of that. So you could really kind of get down into the weeds on the numbers. And it's just the sheer number of applicants with high scores and good profiles and that kind of thing competing for relatively few spots in the class. That's what we mean by overrepresentation. We see it translate into scores as well. And here's where profile reviews and understanding the landscape comes into play. you might see, I talked about data and looking at class profiles before to understand how you kind of stack up. A typical US 10 to 15 ranked program, well, they might have an average GMAT score for their whole class of 715, 720. It'll vary a little bit by school. You might see a middle 80% range, 10th percentile to 90th percentile for that school of like 680, 10th percentile students in the class to like 760. And that'll vary a little bit, 670 to 760, 690 to 760, maybe 660 to 760 on the widest for the widest schools in those ranges. So check out class profile pages. So if 720 is the average and 680 to 760 or 670 to 760 is a middle 80% range for the whole class. We have seen data for similar schools also in that 10 to 15 range of the US rankings, where the Indian students in the class have a middle 80% GMAT range, not of 670 to 760 like the whole class, but of 730 to 780. That comes from one school in that range, but it is representative, I would say. So 10th for Indian students in this representative T10 to T15, 730 is a 10th percentile score for schools for students in there, and 780 is 90th percentile. So you could think about what that bell curve looks like. We can interpolate the midpoint to be around 755. I mean, it's not necessarily a symmetrical bell curve, but that's where how overrepresentation can then affect things, because an applicant from an underrepresented pool or from a more of a unique profile or what have you, scores can, you can see how scores vary and can affect decisions and strategy and such. So that's a little bit of an aside there. Rephrasing Rahaki's question, is this scenario, layoffs due to COVID, applicable to retail jobs as well? Yeah, I would say so. COVID, very unique, as we all know, and its ripple effects are pronounced through a variety of industries, and retail, I mean, e-commerce retail, like Amazon, some of those blew up, people can buy from home and they're up, but traditional retail or brick and mortar retail, yeah, I think it feels more justified and more kind of explainable and understandable on the part of an admissions committee, so that even in normal years, if the generalization might be that it is more difficult to apply from a point of unemployment, I think it's a little more understandable and explainable in these situations. But show what you've done, show what you're doing, explain. If you got laid off and haven't kind of moved the needle on anything or done anything or improved thyself or are not in process of finding a new job or something like that, that's a little different. But if you have, and if something's on the horizon, and if you've taken the opportunity to start a blog or take courses or start a little business that you've always thought about doing, well, now you have some proof points. Or if you're in the process of interviewing and something feels like it's on the horizon, then I think those signs point more toward, if everything else lines up and you've got your scores, then you probably could look at round one and not wait. But if you haven't built any of those, then maybe it's worth talking about or thinking about. Let's do one more question here. Is an alumni letter of recommendation a good one, even if I haven't worked with him and her? The short answer to that would be no. You do need to work. That's what I would say, pretty black and white for all the nuance and detail I probably inundate you with on these calls. You want your letters of recommendation. You are typically going to need 2 for an average school. Some schools have moved toward 1. You want and need to have worked with that person, and really ideally at a very deep level. So take a look at the schools you're applying to, where they describe what's required of your recommenders and who you should ask. It will almost always say things like I just said, where most schools will actually want your direct supervisor, and then the other kind of explanatory information that surrounds that. we'll say, if it's not a direct supervisor, or for your second recommendation, you should be looking at people who worked with you directly and deeply. Sometimes too, that plays into like how far, like, should I ask my manager's manager's manager because their title looks good? The answer there is often going to be no as well. You want people who really can go into detail about you. Recommender selection and recommendation strategy are often overlooked. I think on the applicant's part, it's something we spend a lot of time talking about and strategizing about when we work with applicants. Your recommenders are and should be the ones who write the recommendations, but it's not something you should just tap your recommender on the shoulder and say, here are my deadlines, go get them. You want to, and if you have a relationship with them, choose them carefully. Build your short list. Who are the 3 or 4 or 5 people that you think could be potential recommenders? Let's talk through those, the pros and cons of each. What could each of them talk about? How much of an endorser of you are they? How long have you worked together? There's a variety of things to think through there. Even at a more protracted level, looking at the questions that they're going to need to answer, which are often uniform with some exceptions between schools. What are the strengths and themes and specific examples that each of them could potentially discuss? The same way you might go into a performance review at year end and prepare a 1 or 2 page highlight reel or summary document for your job to remind your boss what you accomplished this year. Think about preparing something like that for your recommenders. Really think, and we think through those with you. Again, it doesn't mean that you're writing the recommendation for your recommender. They can and should be, and you are often signing something that says you've not seen these, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't sit down with them, explain the process, explain the deadlines, and have ideas around reminding them of the specifics of projects. We want them to be super specific. An alum who you haven't worked with is not going to be able to provide that hyper level of specificity. Last little side thought, though, is just to watch out, because there are some schools which welcome endorsements from alumni. I talked about Fuqua a lot earlier. They have a portal on their website where a current student that you know and has a relationship with you, or an alum, or some sort of member of the Fuqua community, can submit an alumni endorsement. So take a look at that. Some schools have that either formally, like Fuqua. Booth has something similar called Shape the Class, either formally, others have it informally. But always check, because some schools will always check the recommendation page. Other schools will say, don't send us anything else. So thank you all who hung around or joined along the way. I know it was a long call, but we do like to go into the weeds here. I should have popped this up on the page, but the links have been shared by GMAT Club as well. We appreciate your joining. We look forward to the next one, and would be happy again to connect for free consultations, not only to talk about rounds and such, but also to talk about your profile and schools and potential storylines and how we approach those things. And we would, of course, welcome the opportunity to partner with applicants in any capacity, really. We have, of course, comprehensive packages, but whatever fits your needs and what you're looking to invest in this process, we believe there's always a way, small, medium, or large engagement to partner and have impact and help you cultivate and deliver your story. We encourage you to read through those testimonials, because I think you'll find a lot of detail in there about how in-depth this process is, but not in a way where we're doing things for you. That's not what this is. I think you'll find benefits even written about in those testimonials, where people feel like after going through this process together, they are more capable and practiced and trained in messaging and how to convey their story and interview preparation, and a lot of the skill development that is going to be salient, relevant, and helpful and beneficial once you're in an MBA program and looking for jobs and taking next steps in your career. So we appreciate that, and thank everyone for joining, and look forward to next time. Have a great day and a great weekend.